The first book that I want to cover in this series of looking at books on theology of work and sharing some things that I have appreciated about them, learned from them. The first one is one of the greats. It is by Timothy Keller. It is called Every Good Endeavor, Connecting Your Work to God's Work. And in the last episode, episode 37, I shared some of the things that you tend to find in all the books on theology of work, and all of those things are in this book. So I'm not going to repeat much of that, but I'm going to focus on a number of things that I found particularly insightful, helpful, and stimulating from this book. So Timothy Keller, Connecting Your Work to God's Work. The first thing that I really appreciated in this book, this is on page 23. I mentioned in the last episode that books on theology of work regularly tie work with meaning, because work is a function of being made in God's image. That is how we find our meaning and significance in life. And I just really appreciate it. So I'm going to read a little bit of what he says about that. He says, this is page 23, the fact that God put work in paradise is startling to us because we so often think of work as a necessary evil or even punishment. Yet we do not see, that is in the Bible, we do not see work brought into our human story after the fall of Adam as part of the resulting brokenness and curse. It is part of the blessedness of the garden of God. Work is as much a basic human need as food, beauty, rest, friendship, prayer, and sexuality. It is not simply medicine, but food for our soul. Without meaningful work, we sense significant loss and emptiness. People who are cut off from work because of physical or other reasons quickly discover how much they need work to thrive emotionally, physically, and spiritually. So to say that in my own words, we find meaning in work. And if we don't work, we lose meaning. And I think it's helpful. He goes on specifically to talk about work among developmentally disabled adults and special education contexts and so forth. And I think that's one of the important lanes in this conversation. Those whom society would view as less able to do anything that would contribute towards society need work. And there's a conversation about what that work can and should be for their benefit. There's also a conversation here about retirement and the idea that if I can just get to 55 or 60 or 65 and have enough money saved up, I can finally quit this awful thing called work and go do whatever I want for the rest of my life. And what I have seen, what you have seen, what we have seen as a society is 10 or 20 or 25 years of no particular thing in our lives that needs to be done is not a good plan and leads, as he said, to the loss of significance and emotional, physical, and spiritual thriving. So there's a conversation about retirement. There's also a conversation about kids and the idea that a child needs to work. Now, I'm not talking about 7-year-olds supporting their own way through life immediately, but I am talking about a child who lives in a home, who makes a contribution to that home, and of course doesn't enjoy that necessarily. But if God has wired image bearers to work and children are image bearers, then children need to work. And any given home and family context is going to have different ways of going about that. But I notice as I raise my own children, part of my job as a parent is to teach them to work, not just so they can have a career, make money, all those sorts of things, but because that is what God created them to do. The next thing I noticed in here, this is just page 24, the next page over. Keller will later on, and I'll say more about this in a bit, he'll say a fair bit about rest. He does a great job of talking about rest and Sabbath, but he notices here when it comes to the role of work in the meaningful human life, he says the Bible, quote, does not say we should work 1 day and rest 6, or that work and rest should be balanced evenly, but directs us to the opposite ratio. Leisure and pleasure are great goods, but we can only take so much of them. This has all kinds of counterculturalness to it. We long for, I mentioned this in retirement with kids, in lots of different ways. We have a cultural moment where the goal is often get out of work as quickly as possible, because the good life is the leisure, the real life, the part that we can really enjoy and sink our teeth into is the stuff that happens outside of work. And Keller simply says, hey, at the very beginning, the majority of life is work. And there's rest, and that's good. We'll talk about that. But notice the ratio, 6 days work, 1 day rest. There's a lot more work in life than there is rest. And that's how God wired it. And too much leisure is actually not good for us. And I appreciated him saying that. Moving on a little further, just to page 25, in, let's say, my particular cultural context, I don't want to stereotype too much as though I know what every cultural moment is like, but I'll say in my own context, there is often a linkage between leisure and freedom. So work is what I have to do. Leisure is when I get to be free to do what I want to do. But Keller says, this is page 25, freedom is not so much the absence of restrictions as finding the right ones, those that fit with the realities of our own nature and those of the world. And so he'll talk about a fish. And you might think, well, a fish to be free needs to be rendered absent from all restrictions. He says, no, that's crazy. A fish is free when it is restricted by being in the water. This is his quote. If a fish is, quote, freed from the river and put out on the grass to explore, its freedom to move and soon even to live is destroyed. The fish is not more free, but less free if it cannot honor the reality of its nature. And the same is true of us. So if God designed us to work, that is the thing he made us for, and then we don't do that, we are not more free by the absence of work. We are less free, because to be free is to live according to how we were designed in the first place. A little later, this is now on page 32, he quotes Aristotle, Greek philosopher, as saying that unemployment, by which Aristotle meant the ability to live without having to work, was a primary qualification for a genuinely worthy life. Let me read that again. Aristotle said that unemployment, by which he meant the ability to live without having to work, was a primary qualification for a genuinely worthwhile life. I think there's a few nuances to put on that. First of all, when Aristotle says unemployment, he doesn't mean poverty. He means exactly the opposite of that. He means not that you don't have an income and therefore don't have a life. He means that you don't need an income because you already have a life put together apart from that. So you are fiscally free from the need to have a job. That's what he means by unemployment, which is not exactly how we would typically use that term. There's an interesting linguistic point to be made here, where the language of scholar and scholarship and scholastic and these sorts of things are related in Greek to the language for leisure and luxury, because who has the opportunity to sit and read and think all day? Well, only somebody whose financial needs are already being met in some other way. And so there was this connection for Aristotle between being a thinker, which to him, it was in some sense the highest form of a human life, to be one who could contemplate and meditate and so forth, because financial needs were already out of the way. And so Aristotle, in some sense, is saying, if you don't have to work, that is the gateway to the best possible life. And I think I want to caveat that a number of ways. First of all, I want to define meditation, contemplation, thinking, philosophy, theology. I might add that in there as well in some sense, as work. To work with your mind is a form of work, just like working with your body is a form of work. Now, not all of us have the opportunity to be paid for those various kinds of works. Some people are paid to work with their minds, and then they go home in the evenings and go out into their workshops so that they can do something luxurious like work with their hands. And other people work with their hands all day so that they can go home in the evenings and sit on the couch and pick up a book. And so I don't think it's helpful to name what we do with our hands as work and what we do with our minds as something else. I would want to say that differently. Both can be work and both can be leisure. What I do notice today more, perhaps, and I won't pretend to be an expert sociologically on this, but at least I'm running into it more, is the idea that we work until we don't have to anymore because we've got enough money used to mean do that until you can play golf and do whatever and do nothing. And what has perhaps shifted a bit, as far as I can tell, is more and more people saying, I'm going to make enough money, not so I can quit working, but so I can do something that I genuinely love that actually is a service to society. It is work, and it doesn't need to pay. I can do it whether or not there's any significant income to it, because I'm free in that sense. And at that point, I would probably want to say something positive about Aristotle's perspective and say the ability to live without having to work for financial reasons opens up all sorts of possibilities for someone to work for other motivations than making a living, making enough money to pay the bills and so forth. So there is something I would want to push back against, as Keller does, on this idea that unemployment is the best life available, because there is nothing wrong with working to feed a family, to feed oneself, to pay the bills. But it is true, economically speaking, that if I do not have financial constraints and I can simply choose the work that I think maybe God has wired me to do without having to think about the money, then something very good can come of that. The next thing I wanted to notice in Keller's book, this is now on page 37, he wants us to lose our distinction. And I mentioned this a moment ago already, or at least to minimize the distinction between what we might call knowledge work and manual work. And there has long been reason in certain circles to see knowledge work, and this is going back to Aristotle a little bit, knowledge work as a higher form of work and manual work as a lower form of work. And he says, this is Keller, in Genesis, we see God as a gardener. And in the New Testament, we see God as a carpenter. No task is too small a vessel to hold the immense dignity of work given by God. Simple physical labor is God's work no less than the formulation of theological truth. And so if you have come up in a context where the carpenter, the farmer, the plumber, the cleaner, the cook, the dishwasher, the day laborer, they just sort of do what they have to do, but the pastor or the theologian, they do the things that God really loves. Keller helpfully says, I'll read this again, no task, whether knowledge or manual or whatever, no task is too small a vessel to hold the immense dignity of work given by God. Every work that we receive from God is a good gift. It doesn't necessarily matter what kind of work it is good. Jumping ahead, this is now page 47. I'll read a bit of Keller here. If we are to be God's image bearers with regard to creation, then we will carry on his pattern of work. His world is not hostile so that it needs to be beaten down like an enemy. Rather, its potential is undeveloped, so it needs to be cultivated like a garden. We are not to relate to the world as park rangers, whose job it is to not change their space, but to preserve things as they are. Nor are we to pave over the garden of the created world to make a parking lot. No, we are to be gardeners who take an active stance toward their charge. They do not leave the land as it is. They rearrange it in order to make it most fruitful, to draw the potentialities for growth and development out of the soil. I think there's something extremely important there. Over the last couple of decades, 3-4 decades particularly, there has been a segment of environmental perspective, environmental policy, environmental theology in some circles where humanity's role in relation to the rest of creation is to leave it alone. In these perspectives, the best way for us to relate to the non-human, particularly biological creation, is to do nothing. Don't touch, don't change, don't move, don't affect, minimize human impact on the environment at all costs. And Keller rightly says, no, that is not what God has designed us to do. Now, are there human impacts on the environment that are problematic? Absolutely. There's a long conversation to have about what sorts of impacts and how and when and why and where and in what sequence and so forth. Many details to unpack there. But the simple fact is, God put us in his world to be change agents. If we go back to Genesis 1 and we see God moving creation from chaos into an increased state of order, but the order that he brings creation into is not a static order. There is no pristine state from which we should never deviate. God creates planets to move. God creates plants to grow and to be cultivated and to be harvested. Creation around us changes because God made it dynamic by nature, and our job is not to step away from that dynamism. It is rather to engage fully in it, to be how God changes his creation to become more of what he wants it to be. And so, like Keller says, as gardeners, we don't just sit there and look at it and hope the right things grow. We plant, we harvest, we weed, we till, we fertilize. These are all ways that we have an effect on the creation around us. And that can be at least very, very good. Moving forward a little bit, page 65, this is Keller talking about work as an act of love. And so he's going to quote Lester DeCoster, who says this: work is the form in which we make ourselves useful to others and in which others make themselves useful to us. So we look at the things around us. I sit in my office and I look at a desk and I think somebody loved me by building this. And in order to build a desk out of wood, there is timber management, there is harvesting, there is cutting, there is planing, there is sanding, there is finishing, there is designing, there is assembling, there is moving. A great deal of human labor went into an act that now I receive as a gift. I look at the books in my office that have been written. I look at the pictures on the wall that have been taken. I look outside and I see a parking lot. I see lights. I see plants. I see 1,000 different things around me that someone else did. I didn't do any of those things. I'm not responsible. I get no credit for any of that work. Other people did that work, and they did that as an act of love for me. So Keller wraps it up this way: there may be no better way to love your neighbor, whether you are writing parking tickets, that's an interesting one, writing software, or writing books, than to simply do your work. And he will say, only skillful, competent work will do. So every time you do your work well, you are doing something that is going to be an act of love to someone else. He gives a rather intense example of this about a United Airlines flight back in 1989 that had a pretty significant blowout up in the air and a bunch of people hurt. The plane is 100 miles from land, and the captain has to be a competent pilot. The passengers do not need him only to pray for them, to disciple them, to tell them about Jesus. Sure, maybe there's a time for all that, but what they really need him to do is be a really good pilot, and that is the act of love that he has for them in that moment. And the same is true for all of us. To do our work well is an act of love for our neighbor, which is, of course, precisely what God has commanded us to do. Now, Keller has a lot of positive things to say about work, but he's not oblivious. I mentioned this back in episode 37. There is a 4-part story that books like this are going to tell. There is the good work that God originally created, but then the second part of the story is how work has been affected by the fall. And so Keller is not clueless to this. There's a lot of positivity, but then later on he'll talk about how work should have been good and wonderful in so many ways, but has become corrupted by sin. And so one example he gives is that even good work, so you do good work that is an act of love for somebody, that work itself can have a negative impact. So work, he says, even when it bears fruit, is, quote, always painful, often miscarries, and sometimes kills us. Cornelius Plantinga wrote a book some years ago called Not the Way It's Supposed to Be. It's about sin. It's a fabulous book. And he in that book talks about sin as both fertile and fatal. Sin has this funny way of killing everything around it, but also growing and increasing in its own life. It's a cancer. It's a virus in some sense like that. And Keller recognizes that work, even when it's good work, even as it has sometimes the results that it was supposed to have, it also comes with often negative side effects. And that's a result of living in the world that we live in. And I think I would want to look at that and say, part of good work under the conditions of the fall then is doing what I can to mitigate those negative effects. And so I might make a YouTube video that's really good. It has that virtue of being high quality, and maybe it says some things, does some things, teaches some things that are beneficial. And yet I also have to recognize that when I make a YouTube video, I am contributing to our current cultural moment's obsession with staring at screens all the time. And so how do I, as a social media content producer, mitigate the negative impact that so much social media has on myself, on the world around me? So work is good. Work is an act of love for neighbor, but because of sin, work also has negative effects, and we need to be aware of those as well. The theology of work movement has bounced around a little bit, and I'll mention some books later on that try to push back against certain trends, certain threads in this conversation. But there is an impetus in the theology of work conversation to be mostly positive about the world. Work is good. Work is not a curse. Work is a gift from God, these sorts of things. And these are all true. And part of why I think that message speaks so well today has to do with some generational dynamics. So Keller, who would be part of the boomer generation, is speaking reflectively here. And he says, this is page 87. He says, while the circumstances shaping my parents' generation, so that would be the World War II generation, while the circumstances shaping that generation perhaps gave them a lower view of work than the one found in the Bible's description of creation. Pause there for a second. So you talk to people, and there aren't a lot of them left at this point. This is 2026. So we're running out of this generation. But there were an awful lot of people who came through, say, the World War II generation or the Depression generation before that. And they said, look, work just has to be done. You don't have to like it. Nobody cares. Get over it. Feed your family, and then you die. And that's just what life is. And so out of this comes an impetus toward, hey, if I have enough money not to work, why in the world would I? I'm going to go play golf because I've had a hard life so far. And so there is a generational dynamic where if it was fun, they wouldn't call it work. And that was the dominant mantra. But then Keller goes on to say, so my children's generation, so now we're getting into Gen X and so forth and beyond that, has a more naive and utopian view of work than is suggested by the Bible in its description of the world's fall into sin. So we had a previous generation that said work is pain, get over it. And now we've got newer generations that are saying, I don't want my work to be pain. I want my work to be good. I want it to be fulfilling. I want it to be meaningful. I want to know that I'm making a difference in the world. I want to thrive and love my work. And I think the truth lies, and this is where Keller will go with it, the truth lies somewhere in the combination of the two, because you have an older generation that is acutely aware of Genesis 3. And you have newer generations that are becoming more acutely aware of Genesis 1 and 2. And the fact is, they're both there. The fact is that work is meant to be a conduit through which we find meaning and significance. And we are given from God to work in ways that have the proper effect on the world around us. And that's a beautiful thing. And that's good and wonderful. And that's where this whole story is going in eternity. And we're not there yet. Sometimes work is a pain, and that doesn't make it unnecessary. I'm a professor. I work with college students. And so some of the conversations I have with my students are about the fact that they have more interest, I think, than previous generations in getting out of college and immediately finding a high impact, high fulfillment job and just loving it for the rest of their life. And of course, the older generation is just rolling their eyes at that, saying that's not how the world is. And they're right, that's not how the world is. There is such a thing as an entry-level job that can be good work into itself and can be a means to an end of something that feels more fulfilling and significant, that doesn't make the entry-level job unnecessary or bad. So a lot of nuances to make there. The fact is, work is designed by God to be good and meaningful and fulfilling, and some generations are a little more in tune to that. The fact is also we live in a world affected by sin and the fall and the curse, and so work is not always and will not always be what it was meant to be this side of eternity. And there are some generations who have a better perspective on that, and we need to keep both of those in mind at all costs, at all times. Later on in the book, I'm jumping ahead. This is page 174. He comes back to this issue in talking specifically about the role of a Christian artist. So he says this: the gospel worldview equips the artist, as it does the journalist, for another example, for a unique combination of optimism and realism about life. The gospel is more globally pessimistic about human nature than virtually any other view of things. Each of us is capable of the worst kind of evil, and there's nothing we can do to change ourselves or even see ourselves in our true light without God's help. And yet, on the basis of God's salvation in Christ, the gospel allows us to be at the same time deeply optimistic, envisioning not simply heaven, but a perfectly renewed material creation. So artists shaped by the gospel cannot be characterized either by sentimentality or bitter hopelessness. So he specifically speaks to those in art, whether it be visual art or music or speech, communication of various kinds, writers, poets, storytellers, and says a Christian in those spaces, a person shaped by the gospel in those spaces, cannot be overly idealistic about the world, nor can it be entirely hopeless about the world either. And I think about this with respect to music in the church. I can't speak for everyone's context. I'll speak to my own. In my own Christian journey, the churches I've been a part of, we have been far quicker to sing songs about how wonderful God is and how good God is and how good the things are that he's done for us. We have not been as quick to sing songs about how broken things are. If I were to map this onto Scripture itself, I would say we tend much more strongly toward the praise psalms and much less toward the lament psalms. But both reality around us and the Bible itself tells us, hey, there are dozens of lament psalms in the Bible for a reason. And it is part of the role of the Christian artist to name the brokenness of the world for what it is. This is a tricky thing, not to get too into the weeds on one tactic, but when I think about, let's say, war movies, I'm not advocating for showing war in its entirety on the screen. Obviously, we can't do that exactly. War is too horrific for that. But movies that minimize violence can tend to glorify violence and make those of us who have not really experienced real violence feel like, oh, war doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Violence and those sorts of things don't seem that bloody. They don't seem that horrific. Whereas a movie that takes us a little deeper into the darkness can have the effect of giving us a better sense of reality. These things truly are horrific. The world truly is broken. And Keller would say, and I think there's something true about this, it is the task of the Christian artist to name the brokenness of the world and not be, as he says, overly utopian or idealistic about it. Now, speaking of not being overly utopian or idealistic, I mentioned in the previous episode 37, that the vast majority of books on the theology of work, when they come to the question of sin and the fall, will inevitably find their way to Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is this book about a man who looks at all the things that he can from the perspective of being under the sun, meaning if you bracket God out of the equation for a moment, what is this life? What is this world? And he says it's all meaningless. It's all emptiness. It's all vanity. It's all chasing after the wind. It's not worthwhile. It doesn't stay. It doesn't hold. And so whatever. And of course, he'll come back around and say, the end of man is to fear God and enjoy life. And there's goodness because under the sun is not all there is, but we live in a fallen world. And so this feeling of under the sun and the brokenness of things is real and true. And Ecclesiastes is realistically true about that. There was one particular thing about how Keller engaged that conversation that I found helpful. So he says this is page 93. The author of Ecclesiastes is going to push readers toward an understanding of the transcendent uniqueness and necessity of God. Nothing within this world is sufficient basis for a meaningful life here. Now, pause. He is not saying that this life is in fact meaningless, that material existence is meaningless. He's saying that the basis for its meaning is not internal. If we base our lives on work and achievement, on love and pleasure, on knowledge and learning, our existence becomes anxious and fragile because circumstances in life are always threatening the very foundation of our lives, and death inevitably strips us of everything we hold dear. Ecclesiastes is an argument that existential dependence on a gracious creator God is a precondition for unshakable, purposeful life. In other words, what happened in Genesis 3 is that we found ourselves, in a sense, existentially cut off from God. That is a curse. What Ecclesiastes does is name that curse for what it is. So the blessing of the curse is that we are given, not just given a picture, but given an everyday experience of what is life apart from God. This thing that Adam and Eve for a moment thought they wanted, what is it? It's meaningless. It's nothing. It's emptiness. It's vanity. It's death. And so the blessing of waking up in the morning and just groaning and saying, I do not want to do the things in front of me today. It's frustrating. It doesn't work. It feels meaningless. It's pointless. It's not going anywhere. I'm stuck. All of those feelings, Ecclesiastes says, yep, if life only under the sun is all there is, that is what it is. You are not going to get past that curse apart from the inbreaking of God. And so there's a blessing in Ecclesiastes pointing out reality for what it is because it points us back to God. I'm jumping ahead a fair bit here. So this is now page 186. He's now in the part of the story where we're saying Christ has come, Christ has redeemed. What now? And he points out what's fairly obvious. It is not the case that a person in Christ simply becomes better at their work than a non-Christian, or that a non-Christian can't do anything. So he says, we might think that non-Christians cannot do good work, or that everything a Christian does at their job must be completely and obviously different from everything a non-believer does. That is obviously not the case. And so from there, he's going to go on to talk about this idea of providence. Providence is a doctrine having to do with how and in what manner God sustains the world. This is the big picture of God is keeping the story of his creation moving forward. And he says this, work is a major instrument of God's providence. It is how he sustains the human world. And so when you think about the societal, political, economic structures, the infrastructure of the town you live in or the community you live in, the roads, the electricity, the grids, the networks, the systems, the stores, the shipping and receiving, the manufacturing, all of the things that keep human society on track, these are functions of God's providence, whether they are performed specifically by believers or unbelievers. It doesn't actually matter. What that leads us to, I think very helpfully, is a wider sense of God's work in the world. And here's why I think that is important. We as Christians struggle, I think, to be consistent on this point. When I go to get my car worked on, I generally don't care if my mechanic is a believer or not. Now, I care about integrity. I care about ethics, and of course I care about skill, but I don't stop and say, well, this person's ability to get my car up and running is a function of their faith in Christ. I do not assume that. I assume that their ability to get my car running is a function of their skill in working on cars, and that's it. And so I, as a Christian, have assumed something that Keller will talk about later on that theologians and the church has called common grace. The rain falls, this is a positive image, the rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous. There is some sense in which a farmer is a good farmer if they know how to be a good farmer, whether or not they know Jesus. And the beauty of this is, according to Keller, when a person is skilled in their work, Christian or non-Christian, believer in Jesus or not believer in Jesus, when a person is skilled in their work, they are operating out of God's providential care for his creatures. So he says it this way, this is on page 190, every advancement in learning, every work of art, every innovation in healthcare or technology or management or governance is simply God opening his book of creation and revealing his truth to us. And he says, look, of course, the vast majority of farmers in the history of the world didn't know that God was doing this. The person who moves technology forward may or may not be aware that they are providential instruments in the hands of a good God, but they are. That is a fact. And so I can look around me and see the good work that non-Christians are doing and say, thank you, sovereign God, for your providence. Moving on a little bit further, this is page 236. Keller is going to, he's going to quote Dorothy Sayers. And I mentioned this in the previous episode. All good books on theology of work these days quote Dorothy Sayers. And so this is one of many times that he does that. And this is particularly in Sayers' discussion of acedia. It's spelled A-C-E-D-I-A. Acedia is traditionally translated sloth, but she says sloth isn't quite the right version of that because sloth, if we think of that as a synonym for laziness, she says acedia is not necessarily laziness. Acedia is a life driven by mere cost-benefit analysis of what's in it for me. So to quote Sayers directly, acedia is the sin which believes in nothing, cares for nothing, enjoys nothing, loves nothing, hates nothing, finds purpose in nothing, lives for nothing, and only remains alive because there is nothing for which it will die. So the person characterized by acedia is someone whose driving passion, Keller says, is for their own needs, comfort, and interest. Keller says this doesn't necessarily look lazy at all. Indeed, this type of person seems to generate lots of activity. So if you picture a person who works very, very hard for themselves, they do not see beyond themselves, this is acedia. It's not necessarily laziness. It can be extremely diligent for themselves. There's an old phrase, I don't know where it originated, it's been around a long time. The Latin version is incurvatus in se, which means humanity curved in on himself. If you can picture a person whose whole world is themselves, they may be very active, they may be very diligent, very industrious, very hardworking, but their work is not from love for God. Their work is not from love for neighbor. There is a form of work that is twisted around itself because it comes from a person who is curved in on themselves. This, Keller, needless to say, is telling us this is not the good work that God has for us. Rather, what God has for us is to work freely within his design as creatures, both contributing to the needs of other creatures and being gracious recipients of meeting our needs by other creatures. This is how God designed us to work, not work in and of and for ourselves. Speaking of the way God has designed us in freedom, I'm going to wrap up with this. This is page 244. Now, Keller is talking about rest. So we moved on from work. We're talking about rest. We're talking about Sabbath. And he's looking at the Sabbath commands in Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. And in Deuteronomy particularly, God says, you are not slaves, therefore Sabbath. And in Exodus particularly, God says, this is the way I've designed you, Sabbath. And so Keller says this, to rest is actually a way to enjoy and honor the goodness of God's creation and our own. To violate the rhythm of work and rest in either direction leads to chaos in our life and in the world around us. Sabbath is therefore a celebration of our design. So this goes back to something he mentioned earlier about a fish in water. The water constrains the fish because it is designed to only live there, but therefore the water also frees the fish and liberates the fish because it can live only there. And so Keller will say Sabbath is a celebration of our design. It is a yes to God saying, I made you like this, when we have a proper work rest rhythm. But then also, as it says in Deuteronomy, Israel, you used to be slaves in Egypt. Slaves don't get no Sabbath. You're not slaves anymore. And therefore, Keller says Sabbath is a declaration of our freedom. It means, this is still quoting Keller, you are not a slave, not to your culture's expectations, your family's hopes, your medical school's demands, not even your own insecurities. So all in all, God created us to work most of the time, to rest some of the time, and because he knows what he's doing as a creator, this is the life most worth living, to live according to our freedom and to live according to our design. And that, Keller would say, is how we do our good work. So I think that is all I have to say about that. The book, one more time, is by Timothy Keller, Every Good Endeavor. It's good. You should read it. There's a lot of valuable stuff in it beyond what I've talked about in this episode. There is an Amazon link in the show notes to purchase it. If you are so inclined, get the book, read the book, do what it says, and you will get better at your work. And until next time, thanks for listening to the Extreme Stewardship Podcast. My name is Michael Kibbe, and I teach Bible and theology at Great Northern University in Spokane, Washington. My behind-the-scenes partner in this endeavor is Ben Kibbe, CEO of Kibbe Consulting in Columbiana, Ohio. Our editor-in-chief is Liam Olmsted. Art comes from Leah Leanhoutz, and music is provided by Dave Murray of Derridune Guitars. If this podcast has been useful or challenging to you, shoot us an email, extremestewards@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. If you think it might be useful or challenging to anyone else, well, you know what to do. Ultimately, we hope that listening to this podcast has helped you get better at making things good and good at making things better.